A lot of what I wanted to talk about has been discussed already, but I do have some slides here with respect to sensitivity, specificity, recovery curves, etc. But when we started studying this 20 years ago now, considering balance as a component in terms of a diagnostic indicator for concussion recovery, there were a lot of people who doubted whether there really were balance problems following concussion. Many of you have seen this, but for those of you who haven't, I think this will one example. What we might see or not see on the sideline if we miss this. They're not always as obvious as this. This is a play from 2 seasons ago in the NFL.
Here he is right here. Right into the right hip of Ernie Sims. Bradley, who missed all of last year here in the opener, and it's one player going down after another. That's hard to watch.
So I think with the inclusion of the balance assessment in the sideline evaluation, the NFL's tool and several other organizations, concussion assessment tool, sideline assessment tool, we're hopefully going to catch that if this is missed, because this individual was returned back in to the same game, just shortly after that. So the balance error scoring system, the practicality of this, I'm not going to go through the scoring of it, other than to say that it takes approximately 6 to 7 minutes to administer this if you're going to do it accurately. And this is using both the firm surface and the foam surface, the modified vest, which is part of the SCAT-2, simply uses the first 3 trials there, this double leg, single leg, and tandem stance on a firm surface. There have been a lot of these numbers have been reported already today, but in terms of reviewing the balance and concussion literature, if we look at the balance error scoring system, a number of studies have reported sensitivity and specificity, detection of concussion group versus control groups in terms of looking at the elevated best scores with this test. The higher the score, the worse off it is, because we're measuring errors here. And we've also, a few studies have looked at protracted recovery, and I'll show you another slide of a recent study that we just published on this. Certainly not a sideline assessment tool, but more of a clinical tool, the sensory organization test. We've a number of places utilized this for clinical concussion balance testing. It's a more sophisticated way using a force plate system. And the nice thing about the SOT is that it allows us to sort of differentiate between what may be a visual deficit that's leading to the balance problem versus a vestibular or somatosensory deficit that's contributing to the balance problem. So this is really useful, and again, there have been published papers looking at the sensitivity and specificity of the SOT, its ability to detect, again, group differences versus uninjured control group differences, and again, likewise, looking at protracted recovery. So a very useful tool, clinically, certainly not a sideline tool in terms of helping us to think about return back to the play. And more recently, there have been some good work, research conducted, looking at gait and virtual reality. Some work by Sam Slobanoff, who's here with us at the meeting, and looking at center of mass deviation on certain tasks, gait and virtual reality. And so I think that while there is a limited number of Class 1, Class 2 publications in this area, there certainly is a growing body of literature on this that I think we'll be hearing more about and contributing to the balance literature following concussion. This is work that's not published, but in the works, looking at 203 concussed high school and collegiate athletes over about an 8-year period. This is now looking at change from baseline. And so these best scores may appear to be low in this injury group, common injury here, but again, it's a change from baseline, understanding that an average baseline best score in an uninjured individual is somewhere in the neighborhood of 8 to 12 points. And so clearly, as we see these elevated scores at the injury at 1 to 3 hours post-injury, and then a nice recovery curve, looking at this, clearly an indication that this is a useful tool on the sideline at the time of the injury. We've also, we're in the process of breaking this down, looking to see whether or not these best scores at the time of injury and post-event are prognostic markers for, if amnesia and or loss of consciousness are good prognostic markers for delayed recovery on the best. And you can see here with the area under the curve here that certainly those with 30 minutes of amnesia will have a larger area in terms of their elevated best scores relative to the other two groups, the group without amnesia and the group with minimal amnesia. And likewise, looking at loss of consciousness, those in red with LOC and those without LOC, for some reason you would think that this LOC group would have an elevated group. This was a bit of a surprising finding, but again, this is one of the challenges I think was already mentioned earlier, with looking at group data or mean data. And so certainly an elevated score at the time of injury, slightly elevated score there for the LOC group, but it actually recovered more quickly. So again, important to look at these on an individual basis. And also looking at this with respect to prior concussion history, those with 2 or more previous concussions, again, in a very large sample size, showing significantly elevated best scores at the time of the injury and post-injury in day 1 relative to the other 2 groups. So again, I think another way to break this down and look at this. A recent paper that Mike McCrae and our group has published, it's only been out for just a few weeks now, published in JINS within the last 2 or 3 weeks. Again, arguably being the largest sample size of concussed athletes, 570 concussed high school and collegiate athletes, 166 controls. And again, at the time of the concussion represented there at CC, and then within a 3-hour window post-injury, showing elevated best scores. And what's interesting, so if we're looking at just the time of injury scores here, we look at those that had a prolonged recovery where signs and symptoms lasted beyond 7 days, showing an elevated best score relative to those that had a more typical recovery curve where signs and symptoms resolved within 7 days. So it's an interesting finding there, and encourage you to look at this study relative to control subjects. Certainly, we see a very subtle practice effect with this, with repeated taking of multiple or serial testing using the best. We see a subtle decline in best scores or improved performance here over time. Another paper that I'd like to mention we published recently, Dr. John Mihalik, who's here with us, part of our research group at UNC. We looked at 100 concussed collegiate-age athletes. We published this last October, and with the question being to take a look, rather than looking at grouped or mean data, as was already mentioned earlier, they can be a challenge, to look at this from a different perspective and look to see what proportion of concussed athletes with impairment, that had impairment disagreements across various clinical concussion assessment measures. So looking at rated symptom checklist scores, computerized neuropsychological scores, and balance scores using the sensory organization test. And looking at this, the post-injury scores here within 72 hours post-injury compared to their preseason baselines on all 100 of these collegiate athletes, we don't see significant deficits in many of these. Looking at the group data, in fact, in a few cases, we see improvements within this window. And you can see certainly a significant proportion of them reporting symptoms within that window. So what were the key findings with this? Well, we see that in terms of looking at our balance, this is using the sensory organization composite score, that we had nearly 30% of these concussed athletes did show an impairment relative to baseline following the injury. But what's interesting is that there were significant disagreements between symptom severity total scores and all other measures, being the neuropsychological domains and the balance testing. Symptom severity total scores identified more impairments than all other measures. And I want to emphasize that the way in which we conduct these rated symptom checklist scores and ascertain this information is with an interview with that athlete. So we're scoring it as we're sitting here. We're not putting a sheet of paper in front of them and asking them to complete this on a computer. And I think that's an important point that I want to make, and I think something that I hope will be emphasized in the upcoming changes to the document. Significant disagreements were observed for half of the clinical measures the study with disagreeing proportions ranging from 22 to 52%. Really, I think it's just placing further emphasis on this need for a multifaceted approach to concussion assessment. We found that we're going to see some individuals are going to show impairments on neuropsychological testing, while others may not show deficits in balance testing and vice versa. So I think this is important. In terms of just a few other key findings here, what was interesting was that self-reported cognitive impairment by the athlete during the interview was reported by nearly half of these concussed athletes, yet neuropsych testing did not identify many of these athletes as impaired. 30%, in fact, of the athletes who were impaired on the graded symptom checklist would have been cleared if only neuropsych testing were utilized. Likewise, nearly a third of the concussed athletes reported either a balance problem or dizziness, but the SOT did not pick this up. And again, 30% of them would have been impaired on the graded symptom checklist using this interview style if they had been cleared on the SOT or the balance test only. So again, this emphasis on sort of a multifaceted or multimodal approach, as Paul mentioned earlier. And I think, again, unless needed for academic or other outside performance-based decisions, we recommended that the use of computerized neuropsych testing probably is not clinically beneficial while that athlete is still symptomatic. Now, there's some debate out there about when to administer the testing, but we certainly think this adds further evidence to waiting until they're symptomatic. I just want to show you one last quick clip here. And this is an athlete that we assessed a few years ago.
To get Cullen on the ice against this Ranger Ford line. Stillman. Cullen got knocked down. He's aboard. His challenge.
And we sometimes use this to emphasize the importance, again, of this sort of taking everything into consideration. He was cleared within 48 hours because he cleared on his computerized neuropsych testing, but hadn't really gone through a thorough balance evaluation. He barely made it through the first shift on the ice in that game, just 48 hours after that injury. This goes back several years ago before the NHL had a more comprehensive approach to managing this. And he spent about 7 weeks with us rehabilitating for a vestibular problem following that injury. It was missed. Barely made it off the ice again following that assessment, or following the clearance on the neurocognitive testing. So again, this multimodal approach being important. So before I give a few recommendations in focusing in on the balanced error scoring system, because it does appear to be the one tool that can be used on the sideline, thinking about the practicality of it. We conducted a systematic review of the BESS here and published this last year, and a number of studies have looked at the BESS from a number of sort of different angles. This first figure just showing reliability of the instrument and looking at it in different in different populations. And so again, shown to be reliable. Steve Roeder's paper looking at the generalizability of it, suggesting that perhaps 3 trials, the average of 3 trials, may be more beneficial, that sort of rules out the practice effect that has already been described today. As we look at this with respect to different populations, I've already mentioned the studies here that have found differences, group differences between concussed and uninjured athletes. Likewise, Grant Iverson's looked at this with respect to differences across the age lifespan, and certainly seen that there are higher scores, significantly higher scores in the older populations. A number of other studies have been conducted on this, looking at the tape and brace versus just conducting the test using a standardized sort of barefoot, using no shoes. Again, showing some changes, the brace conditions here in the study by Broglio, again suggesting that the balanced error scores are slightly higher in that situation. So I encourage you to look at this. I think it's practical. We've looked at this under fatigue conditions versus non-fatigue conditions, and showing again that it can be used on the sideline, but perhaps we may want to wait a certain period of time to re-administer the test to assume that we're back to baseline if we're trying to use it as a clinical measure or marker for concussion. So in conclusion, and considering a few recommendations, I've underlined the word practical. I certainly think there's sufficient evidence to, in numerous studies that have shown we can administer the Balance Air scoring system on the sideline. And other studies have shown that the standard Romberg test is simply just not objective enough, and it's very subjective in the way in which it's conducted. So I think that it is an important diagnostic indicator of neurological impairment. Again, I'll emphasize later in combination with other tools that can be used immediately following concussion and should be assessed in an objective manner. Both the BEST and the SOT have been shown to be valid and reliable for assessing recovery following concussion. I do think we need to better understand the sensitivity of the modified BEST, because as you break most of these studies out and look at the foam stances relative to the firm stances, it's the foam stances, 4, 5, and 6, using the double leg, single leg, and tandem that are more sensitive to concussion. And so I think that's a consideration that we need to discuss. And then finally, balance should be objectively assessed at the sideline and serially in the clinic to track recovery